So what Git does, it's really simple. When you work on certain files on your computer, every time you make a change, you lose the previous version. So if I have a file on my computer, it's an image, it's a text, it's anything. So you start and you say, this was my first day at WDX. Now, you decide to change this file. This is a text file, okay? You decide to change the file and say, this was my second day. Now, every time you change a file on your computer, the previous version, right, it's lost forever unless you remember the changes that you did. In this case, it was easy. It was just a word. First became second. But as you can guess, this cannot happen in real life. Over time, over many changes, you will forget about what you did yesterday, or even worse, like 6 months before. So this is what happens when we change things on our computer without Git. Every change we make on any file, we get a new version, and the old version gets lost in, out there in the ether. It's gone forever. So this is how we normally work with our files on our computer. When we're working, especially when we're working with code, we don't want to work in this way. Why? Because if I make a change in my code, right? So now this is not like a simple text file. This is some code. And I make a change and I say, I don't know, I do some change that breaks the code. I accidentally introduced what we call the bug. So I change some line of code, and now my application is completely broken. It doesn't work. If I've lost that change that I made and I forgot what I did, that change that broke the code, I'm in trouble, right? I made the change to a file. I have a new version. The new version doesn't work, and I have no idea what change or changes I did. So this is where Git comes into play, and it says, you know what? This is dangerous. If you change stuff and you forget about what you did, or you lose track of what that previous version was all about, you'll be in big trouble. So what we do is we create a code we create code in a file, and here's the magic of Git. Now, Git creates this kind of like magical shield around our code and our files. You can even use Git for even your diaries. So Git kind of like creates this virtual space. And every time you change something, let me make this a little bit bigger. So when you change your code and you go from version 1 to version 1.1, Git keeps track of all the changes, the past changes. So that's basically Git in a nutshell. Every change you make in any file, it doesn't have to be code. It can even be images. Git keeps track of the previous changes, and you can always go back in history, right? Because that's magic. Why it's magic? Because if these two versions were actually working and version 1.2 breaks stuff, you can always go back in history. You can see which versions actually worked, and you can always switch from version 1.2 to version 1.1 or even 1.0, because these were the versions that actually work. And then you can work from that, and you can create a new version. We can even keep the broken version. We can go from here to 1.2.1, like a small different version. So we can do magical stuff like this, you know. Now compare this to how you ordinarily work with your computer. Whenever you change everything, the past is gone forever, unless you keep a backup, and that's a manual, laborious process. But with Git, this all happens magically under the hood. You have to learn a few commands, and then Git makes all this magic happen. You can go back 10 years and see what you wrote in your diary the first day. You can go back to your code like 6 months before. And most importantly, when we work with other coders, because code is kind of like a collaborative process mainly. When you work with other people's code, things break a lot, things break often. A bug or an error can be introduced in the code by some other person, or even you can introduce some error into the code of like a big project. So this is where Git really helps us, keeps track of every single change, and we can always go back in time, and we're always safe and secure. Because if you have a working version of your code, your blog, your whatever, this is kept safely in history, and you can always go back and see what happened. So this is why Git is absolutely crucial, is absolutely important for working with code. Without Git, without this version control, this is called version control, by the way, kind of like the geeky term for Git software, right? This is what Git is all about. Give the power of version control to your project, to your files, to your folders. It doesn't even have to be code. You can write your own biography. And you can use Git to have version control and keep track of changes in what you wrote, in different chapters, in different text changes. And then GitHub says, okay, you like to work with Git. This is, by the way, a Git repository. Whenever you take a folder and you decide to magically enable version control on that folder, you actually create a repo. So repo equals, you learn about design, a folder that remembers. Okay, so that's like a Git repo. Git is a tool that takes a folder and it says, okay, I will put my magic spell over this folder, and now everything that you do, every change that happens, I will remember it. And these repos are really the way to go. These days, even other professionals are using Git and GitHub. Journalists use this for their blogs or for their articles. Doctors, all sorts of like professionals use Git because you can now see the power of keeping track of these previous changes. And GitHub says, okay, this is really cool. So let me store your repositories. You have all these repositories on your computer, but what if your computer breaks down? What if your computer is stolen? What if something happens, like spilling your coffee over your computer? So GitHub says, send me your repositories. This is another repository that you have on your computer. I have like hundreds of repositories on my computer. And it says, let me store this for you. So you upload your repos onto the servers of GitHub, and Microsoft, which runs GitHub, has like a lot of servers. So even if one breaks down, there are like hundreds of thousands of them. So you will never lose access or lose your repositories. So you upload them on GitHub, and then you can access it, and you can safely store them on GitHub, and you can also share it with other people. So that's the gist of the big gist of GitHub and Git.